Varus. Where do I even begin with this guy? Over the years, Riot has retconned several champion backstories, sometimes multiple times to varying degrees of success. However, if you were to ask me what the worst retcon in League's history would be as of this recording, I would have to say it's Varus's bio. It's honestly kind of hilarious how poorly executed this was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As ever, before we can dive into the myriad of problems plaguing Varus today, we need to start at the beginning and unravel this champion's extremely messy history to understand how we got here. So, Varus was released in 2012, back when the Summoners and the Institute of War were still a thing. His backstory was fairly simplistic. Varus was an Ionian archer assigned to guard an ancient temple. Inside this temple was a pit of Pallas. If you're wondering what that is, the old lore never actually explained it beyond some vague evil power, so don't worry too much about it. The important thing here is that Varus was chosen for his supposedly indomitable will, which let him resist the temptations of whatever was contained in the pit. Then the Noxian invasion happened, and Varus's village came under attack. The Noxians were looking to get their hands on whatever power was in that pit, and Varus was faced with a decision. Rush back to his village while foreign troops burned it down and slaughtered his friends and family, or stay and fulfill his duty. Ultimately, Varus chose the latter, single-handedly driving back his foes with nothing but a bow and however many arrows were in his quiver. Alright there, Hawkeye. Ultimately, the Noxians were driven back, but Varus's home was destroyed. His friends, his family, and everyone he'd ever held dear had been slaughtered. In that moment, Varus's will snapped, and the power within the pit beckoned to him. Varus heeded its call, letting it merge with his body so that he might gain the power to avenge his people and slaughter all of Noxus in retaliation. Varus knew that the entity would eventually take over completely and go on a bloody, indiscriminate massacre, but he fought to keep it at bay just long enough that he might see his vengeance through. So yes, Varus was a classic revenge protagonist, a man with nothing left to lose who wanted only to find the people who hurt him and hurt them back. It was simple, but effective. Of course, the main question on everyone's mind was, what exactly was Pallas? In the lore, it, or whatever was bound to Varus, was portrayed like this weird gooey mass that could seemingly mold itself into anything Varus wanted. Of course, being an archer, Varus pretty much always just had to take the form of a bow. Basically, imagine if Hawkeye got semi-possessed by a symbiote. Needless to say, there were many fan theories about what exactly Pallas was. Some presumed it was somehow void-related due to the purplish tint that it had, while others thought it might be something else entirely. And then Aatrox came out. Now, I've got a whole other video about him already, but the key thing you need to know is this. Aatrox was introduced as one of the last remaining Darkin on Runeterra. We didn't know what a Darkin actually was at the time, but many fans took note of the fact that Aatrox's sword was basically alive and also it could drink blood. This led some to the conclusion that Aatrox was actually the sword itself, and it could possess human hosts to turn them into demonic-looking figures, not unlike Soul Edge and Nightmare from Soul Calibur. So, a demonic-looking figure possessed by a parasitic weapon. Yeah, fans were quick to note the parallels between Aatrox and Varus. The only difference was that Varus wasn't actually possessed by his bow, but rather that was just a form he could shift the goo into to fit his needs. By contrast, Aatrox's sword seemed more solid, implying that it wasn't one-to-one the same thing. Still, the opportunity couldn't have been more obvious. We had Pallas, an enigmatic entity that no one knew anything about, and Aatrox, another enigmatic entity that no one knew anything about. They both gave humans some kind of power to crush their foes at the cost of their humanity and their bodies. So there were just enough parallels in place that the two could be connected. Now, I honestly don't believe that Pallas was originally meant to be a Darkin, but it seems like Riot decided that would be the best direction to take things, and I can't entirely disagree. In 2017, Kayn was introduced to the game, alongside his reluctant partner, Rost. This champion was huge for confirming the long-standing theory that Darkin are in fact living weapons that possess their hosts. We still hadn't retconned Varus into being one just yet, but plans to do so were clearly already in place, especially with some of Rost's special interactions toward him. Later that year, Varus was finally retconned into being a Darkin, rather than a shape-shifting massive goop. He was turned into an evil bow that possessed anyone that tried to wield it, much like Aatrox's sword and Rost's scythe. Okay, so far, so good. Frankly, if Riot had just left it at that without altering anything else in Varus' bio, things could have worked out much more smoothly. Alas, it all goes downhill from here. When it comes to Varus' retcon, there are two main points of contention: what it did to the Darkin as a whole, and what it did to Varus himself. We'll start with the former. Alright, so, if you've seen my Aatrox video, you'll know that Varus' initial lore rewrite basically turned the Darkin into aliens. They came to Runeterra to siphon the plant's magical energy, but were stopped when all races of Runeterra united against them. While most of the Darkin were simply driven off, 5 of their strongest generals wound up being trapped within their own weapons somehow. One of these generals, Varus, was stuck in his own bow and hidden away in an Ionian city called Pallas. So immediately you might notice something odd. Varus was originally the name of the person being possessed, and Pallas was the entity possessing him. Now, Varus is the entity that possesses people through his bow, and Pallas is the location where said bow is sealed away. In that case, who or what is he currently possessing? Oh, we'll get back to that in a moment. For now, though, let's focus on the major retcon to the Darkin. Okay, so the Darkin were aliens that wanted to steal Runeterra's magic. While we've had the idea of life on other worlds in Runeterra's universe teased to us before, mainly through offhanded comments from Aurelian Sol, the idea of increasing League scope to a literal cosmic level, at least introducing other alien races, might be a bit much, especially when there's still plenty of room left to grow and explore Runeterra itself. On top of that, the whole invading aliens thing is sort of what the Void is already, so the Darkin might seem a bit redundant in that regard. While I personally didn't think it was the worst thing in the world, it really wasn't the direction I or several others thought they'd go. Frankly, it still baffles me that Riot didn't just take the obvious direction and make the Darkin into a species of demon. I mean, Rost even calls Varus Demon Pants, and Aatrox's ult describes his true form as demonic. And speaking of Aatrox, the Darkin Blade would get an update the following year that retconned all of Varus' alien stuff anyway, making it so that Darkin isn't even the name of a race, just a derogatory term for ascended warriors that fell to madness. While most of the Ascended hosts were ultimately killed in a trap set by the aspect of Twilight, Aatrox and 4 others were sealed inside their own weapons for eternity, as some sort of divine punishment, I guess. Now, the only way they can gain any sort of freedom is just by possessing anyone dumb enough to pick these weapons up. Which brings us to the matter of Varus' current host. Or should I say hosts? Valmar and Kai. Oh boy. Now we get to really complicated matters. Alright, so, the story goes as thus. Like before, the Noxian invasion happened in Ionia, and reached the city of Pallas. 2 hunters by the name of Valmar and Kai, who were also lovers, apparently joined the fight to try to push back the Noxians. Kai was injured in the fight, and Valmar, out of sheer desperation, decided that the ancient forbidden power hidden away in their city's temple might be able to save his dying lover, even though he had no idea what it was or what it could do. Thus, he threw both their bodies into the magical pool of water where Varus's bow was being stored, and that resulted in both hunters being fused into one body as Varus tried to take over them both. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, who are these hunters? Frankly, we don't know much about them. These two have a total of one sentence in the bio that establishes them as beast hunters and heartlights, basically an Ionian term for lovers. Now, some of you might be eagerly typing away at this point. Oh, but they got an entire comic series devoted to them. Yes, that did help a little bit, but not much. Their personalities really do just boil down to flirting and occasional bickering. And sure, it's a little cute at first, but that loses its luster very quickly. Now, because I know someone is going to bring it up, let's just address the elephant in the room here. No, my issue is not that they're gay. I don't have any issues with LGBT people or representation of them in media. Honestly, League has done that kind of representation before, and they've done it better, even if it was only confirmed later on. Because those characters have personalities and backstories beyond their relationship. Like, let me ask you something. Without being told or shown in advance, could you actually distinguish Valmar from Kai or vice versa? How did these two meet? How did they fall in love? We don't know, and clearly we aren't meant to know, because the fact that they love each other is the only major defining character trait that matters. In fact, their love is so strong that it's the only thing keeping them from being completely possessed when they get merged with Varus into some kind of weird amalgam entity. This results in a situation where Valmar is basically the main body, for whatever reason, while Kai and Varus basically act as the angel and devil on his shoulder. Varus is urging Valmar to just go around killing things because he's bitter about being imprisoned, and Kai is just shouting, "Don't give in to hatred, my love," in Valmar's mind. Admittedly, this could be an interesting dynamic to explore, if nothing else. We've had 2-in-1 characters in League before, but a 3-in-1 where the champion has to hear these conflicting voices might be a great opportunity to flesh out all three entities a little more. If only Riot bothered to give Varus new voice lines to reflect this. Yeah, for whatever reason, despite giving Varus a new splash art, a comic, and a freaking music video hyping up this new lore, they never actually bothered to give the in-game champion voice lines that reflect this new dynamic. His short story has Valmar talking with Varus and Kai in his head, but they're totally absent from the game itself. If you never read his bio, you'd have no idea that this archer is supposed to be 3 entities in one. Now, there have been a few accusations thrown around over the years as to why this is the way it is. Some have speculated that Riot, being owned by Chinese company Tencent, didn't want to commit to including this gay representation in League proper because they didn't want to risk upsetting the Eastern market. Others have accused Riot of basically trying to earn LGBT brownie points by making a champion who was originally straight into a gay icon. Frankly, I don't know or even really care all that much what the circumstances behind this decision were. The only thing I'm here to accuse them of is bad storytelling. The fact is that Varus' character was that of a broken man with nothing to lose out for revenge. He was a warrior running on borrowed time, who sacrificed everything he held dear for his duty, only to forsake that duty in the name of vengeance. It may not be particularly original, but it was compelling. Would Varus be able to see his quest fulfilled before he was fully possessed? What would become of him when Pallas inevitably took over? Cliché as it may be, people still love a good revenge story in this day and age. And the fact that we actually got to see brief glimpses of Varus' interactions with his family helped us to sympathize with him at least a little bit. By contrast, his initial retcon gave us 3 characters in one, and none of them were particularly interesting. Valmar and Kai just aren't engaging characters to me. And if you disagree, that's completely fine. But the fact is that they are such non-entities that they're barely established in their own character bio and literally don't even exist in the game itself. As for Varus, the actual champion, he was just made into a sadistic alien with no personality beyond the fact that he apparently loved to torture his enemies with arrows before killing them. Not sure how you torture people with arrows exactly, but add him to the list of hyper sadists in League's roster, I guess. Although, on that note, I guess we should finally move ahead and talk about Varus' current bio. Yes, as you'll recall, I mentioned that Aatrox's rework retconned all the story of the Darken being aliens and turned them into Fallen Ascended. So, how does Varus reconcile this? Well, according to the story, he was a Shuriman archer assigned to protect a temple during the war with Acathia. When Acathian forces attacked his home, Varus chose to stay and defend the temple rather than go to his family's side, which... Wait a moment, this all seems a touch familiar. Yeah, apparently Varus' story received some backlash from the community, so Riot tried to course correct by having their cake and eating it too. They effectively tried to give Varus an almost identical backstory to his first one, with a Shuriman twist this time. Rather than submit to some vaguely demonic entity, however, Varus wound up getting a different sort of power for his efforts. Shurima deemed his loyalty to the Empire above even his own family as a feat worthy of ascension, and so Varus was allowed to become one of the land's venerated god warrior defenders. He fought against the Void when that was unleashed upon the desert, then fought the other Ascended when the Darken War started. From there, things play out more or less the same as before. He's imprisoned in his own bow, hidden away in an Ionian temple by some golden warrior queen we never learn about, and then found by 2 desperate gay hunters. It's really not much of an improvement. They try to recapture what made Varus so appealing to begin with, while still keeping Valmar and Kai as a thing, but it just comes off as half-assed efforts on both fronts. Varus no longer seems like the main character of his own bio, while Valmar and Kai remain generic to the point that some fans legitimately can't remember which one is which. And really, I think that's the core issue behind Varus' current lore state. Not that it has gaze, or that it's tied to Riot's indecisiveness over what the Darken are, but that it's effectively trying to tell the backstories of 3 characters at once. I mean, look at the other Darken. Aatrox's lore is concerned only with telling Aatrox's backstory, and Kane's lore is concerned with only telling the backstory of Kane. The former gives us the bio of the Darken, while the latter gives us the bio of the host. Varus wants to do both and winds up excelling at neither, which is only made more awkward by the fact that none of these 3 entities actually exist in League itself. The Varus we have in League is still basically the original we got all the way back in 2012, as though even Riot doesn't want to acknowledge the mess they've made of this character. Or they're just too lazy to spend the money on 3 new voice actors. As I tried to demonstrate in my own rewrite of the character, I think the story can work. Just dedicate more time to establishing the hunters and their relationship, and rather than having them fuse into a weird gestalt entity, simply have one die and the other take up the Darken's bow out of vengeance. Maybe you can just change Valmar's name to Varus and have the bow itself remain unnamed for the time being. I actually don't think it's too late to course correct either. Varus hasn't actually done anything significant in the lore yet. The last time we saw him, he was just in Shurima again, looking for another Darken who was apparently buried there. Varus has had no interaction with any Shuriman champions, and we haven't had a new Darken champion release yet, so what's the harm, really? It wouldn't contradict his in-game voice lines, that's for sure. Maybe you could say that Aatrox's weirdly jokey taunts wouldn't make sense anymore, but is that really so great a loss? So yeah, as you can tell, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about Varus. Back when I actually played League, he was easily one of my favorite marksmen, and it's just disappointing to see how sloppily he's been handled over the years. The history of the Darkin has had its ups and downs, but if Twilight of the Gods was the high point of that storyline, then Varys' retcon was the low point. I don't think anything short of another rewrite can properly salvage the character at this point. But that depends on whether or not Riot is willing to bite the bullet and retcon both his comic and music video as well. Time alone will tell what becomes of the Arrow of Retribution. Let's just hope that it can't get any worse.